I was thinking about this analogy to start us off today. Imagine for a second that you inherit these highly classified, incredibly detailed blueprints for a state-of-the-art nuclear reactor.
Okay, a nuclear reactor. I'm with you.
Right. So the schematics show you exactly how to generate limitless, clean energy. I mean, enough to power an entire civilization. And the documents, they detail all the fail-safes, the structural load-bearing walls, the exact physics required to keep the core stable.
A whole distribution grid, right?
Exactly. The precise grid needed to send that power to every single home. But instead of reading the schematics and actually building the machine, you take those blueprints, you get them beautifully framed in gold, you hang them on your living room wall.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, and every morning you just stand in front of them and recite the engineering terms out loud, just, hoping the blueprints will magically heat your house.
Wow. I mean, when you frame it like that, it really highlights a profound cognitive dissonance, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because you have this actionable structural mechanism right in front of you, but it's being treated as like a mystical talisman.
And that right there, that is the exact tension we are unpacking today. We're looking at how millions of people treat a constitutional blueprint for human survival exactly like that framed poster on the wall.
Which is just a tragic waste of the material.
Exactly. So today, for our deep dive, we are opening up a staggering set of notes. These are based on an exegetical lecture by the rationalist thinker Allama G. Parwez.
Right, and we should clarify for you listening, he's specifically focusing on Surah Al-Imran.
Yes, verses 28 through 32 of the Quran. And the core mission of our discussion today is to examine what the notes call the ritual trap.
The ritual trap.
Right. Why do people recite these specific verses hoping for invisible, mystical blessings, while, at least according to Parwez's analysis, completely ignoring the socio-economic justice, the geopolitical vigilance, and the actual civilizational architecture they're demanding?
Well, the lecture notes argue that this represents a massive historical misreading of the text. I mean, today, we are going to walk through Parwez's systematic dismantling of that misconception.
Which is quite a heavy lift.
It is, yeah. The goal here is to really shift the paradigm away from viewing this text as a mere religious placeholder. Something meant for an internalized, purely intercessory approach to the divine.
Like monks meditating in isolation in a cave somewhere.
Exactly. What Parwez's framework suggests is that this is actually a constitutional document. It's a treatise on statecraft.
Statecraft, right.
Human psychology, collective governance, and the unyielding laws of social physics. Under this interpretation, the survival of a society is tied entirely to its economic and social justice, not its adherence to rituals.
Which brings me back to the nuclear reactor. If a society has been staring at the poster on the wall for centuries, treating it like a beautiful decoration, where do we even begin to read it correctly?
Right, how do you take it off the wall?
Yeah, how do you decode the engineering terms and actually start building the machine?
So according to the lecture, the first step is purely linguistic. I mean, to read any blueprint, you need to understand its specific symbols and terminology.
Makes sense.
Because if you think a particular schematic symbol means paint this wall blue, but the engineer actually meant install a reinforced steel beam here.
Your entire building is going to collapse the moment you put weight on it.
Precisely. So Parwez starts his exegesis by fundamentally redefining foundational Arabic terms found in the text. He attempts to move them away from what he categorizes as religious definitions.
And by religious, he means?
He views those as mystical, sentimental, or individualistic. And he retranslates them into systemic definitions, which are societal, constitutional, and structural.
Okay, let's give the listener some concrete examples of this linguistic key, because this is where the source material gets incredibly dense and, frankly, fascinating. Let's look at the concept of falsehood, or kiz in Arabic. Now, if I ask anyone on the street what a lie is, the traditional everyday view is pretty straightforward. A lie is simply stating a factual inaccuracy.
Sure.
Like if I have $5 in my pocket and I tell you I have 10, I'm lying. But Parwez's systemic view attempts to upend this basic assumption.
It completely reframes the locus of truth. In the Quranic systemic framework Parwez outlines, kizi is not merely about objective, factual inaccuracy.
Like, really? So what is it?
It is defined fundamentally as a psychological disconnect. It's the severance between the heart, meaning your internal conviction, your true belief, and the tongue, which is your external expression.
Oh, wow. So the alignment is internal to external, not external to the objective world.
Exactly. In this framework, kisbi is the deliberate act of severing your internal truth from your outward speech. And this is true regardless of whether the words spoken happen to be factually correct.
That is wild.
Yeah.
And the text provides a rather mind-bending historical example to prove this mechanism right.
It does. It's a brilliant case study.
Yeah, the notes reference a moment involving a group known as the hypocrites or the munafiq. And this group comes to Muhammad and they say, "We testify you are the messenger of God." Now, factually, objectively, within the context of that specific belief system, that statement is completely true.
The sky is blue, water is wet, he is the messenger.
Exactly. But the Quran explicitly categorizes their statement as a lie, as kiz. And why? Because the notes point out that they didn't actually believe it in their hearts.
Right. The emphasis here is on the absolute priority placed on psychological synchronization. Under Parwez's reading, even if the words coming out of your mouth represent an objective factual truth, if those words do not match the reality of your internal conviction, you're introducing falsehood into the social system.
You are acting as a munafiq.
Exactly. The Quranic framework considers this dual personality, where an individual harbors internal enmity or disbelief while outwardly feigning loyalty and friendship, as the most heinous systemic crime.
Worse than just outright rejecting the system.
Much worse. It is treated as far more dangerous than open, transparent disbelief, which the text terms kufr.
I really want to explore the structural logic of that, because it shifts hypocrisy from, just a personal moral failing to a mechanical vulnerability.
It's a systemic threat.
Think about the reactor again. If you have a massive steel support beam that is visibly cracked, an open enemy, or kuf, the engineers can see it, it's transparent.
You can work around it.
Right. The system can defend itself, reinforce the structure around it, manage the threat safely. But a dual personality is like a beam that looks perfectly solid. It's painted and polished on the outside, but it is totally hollowed out by rust on the inside.
That structural analogy captures Parwez's point perfectly. It introduces fatal deception.
Because it collapses the structure from within the second the system faces external pressure.
Exactly. An open adversary allows a societal system to take necessary precautions. You know exactly where the borders are and where they stand. But a hypocrite uses false oaths as a shield to protect hidden malice.
They sneak past the defenses.
Right. They infiltrate the Markaz Milat.
And that's defined as the central authority of the society, correct?
Yes. They infiltrate the Markaz and they introduce rot into the decision-making process. This is why the source material stresses that the eradication of the dual personality is the highest priority for the survival of the state.
It has to be priority number one.
Because truthfulness, in this systemic view, is not just a polite moral nicety for individuals. It is the absolute synchronization of an individual's internal belief and external speech. Without that synchronization, the society simply cannot function because it cannot trust its own components.
Okay, I hear the structural logic there, and it paints a really compelling picture of an ideal society. But I have to push back here a little bit on behalf of human nature.
Sure, go for it.
Because the real world is infinitely messy. What if telling a lie saves your life or, the life of your family? Isn't expediency, what the text refers to as maslahat, just a reality of practical politics?
That's the common argument, yes.
I mean, think of a theater of war or living under an oppressive regime. If an enemy is at the gates or you're captured, isn't it justifiable to feign friendship or lie about your allegiances just to survive?
It seems like common sense.
Right. So how does Parwez reconcile this demand for absolute psychological synchronization with basic human survival strategies?
Well, the lecture notes tackle that exact question head on. And the answer might be uncomfortable for modern political sensibilities.
Oh.
Parwez argues that the Quranic system, the din, categorically prohibits expedient deceit. There are no asterisks.
None at all.
None.
Yeah.
Now, man-made religions, what the text distinguishes as Mahabbah, historically invent all sorts of justifications for lying. They create theological loopholes under the guise of expediency or political necessity to protect their adherents or their agendas.
Right. It's for the greater good argument.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Parwez points out that religious traditions sometimes even fabricate historical stories about prophets telling expedient lies to get out of tight spots.
Yeah. The notes mention those fabricated stories explicitly, particularly regarding the prophet Abraham. And Parwez argues that attributing lies to prophets, even for a supposedly good cause, is an absolute insult to the concept of prophethood.
It undermines the whole foundation.
Because the primary credential of a messenger in this framework is being Siddiq, which means absolutely, unwaveringly truthful.
Right.
If the founder of the constitutional system can lie for convenience, the whole foundation of objective truth crumbles. If the architect of the reactor ignores the schematics when it's convenient, the whole plant is compromised.
That's the core of the argument right there. If the system allows for maslahat expedient deceit, then who decides what constitutes a valid emergency?
Anyone could just make up an excuse.
Suddenly, every lie can be justified as a necessity, and the dual personality becomes the standard operating procedure of the state. Which brings us to a highly misunderstood term in verse 3.28 of Surah Al-Imran.
Okay, let's look at the verse.
The word is tuqatan. Now, traditionally, throughout various sectarian histories, this root word has been manipulated to justify the concept of tukaya.
Oh, takaya. Let's define that for the listener because it has a really heavy historical footprint.
Yes, it definitely does.
It's essentially the idea that believers, especially when facing intense persecution or living as a vulnerable minority, are permitted by God to feign friendship with their enemies.
Right.
They're allowed to hide their true ideology, their true beliefs, out of fear for their safety or to protect the community. It's basically faking loyalty to save your own skin.
Correct. It's a survival mechanism that emerged from periods of severe political violence. But Parwez's rational extraction attempts to correct this interpretation entirely.
He rejects it.
Completely. He argues that translating tuqatan as a license for hypocritical friendship fundamentally contradicts the entire Quranic prohibition against the dual personality.
That makes sense. You can't outlaw hypocrisy and then say, except when you're scared.
Exactly. Lexicographically, he traces the root of tuqatan to imply taking rigorous, transparent, defensive precaution. It means maintaining operational distance.
Operational distance.
Yes. The term he uses is hazar, which translates to a state of high vigilance.
So it's not about putting on a mask and pretending to agree with an oppressor. It's about operational security.
Exactly. It means you do not share state secrets, you do not form intimate political alliances, and you do not integrate your societal mechanisms with external factions whose ideologies fundamentally clash with your own.
You just keep them at arm's length.
You maintain strict defensive borders, both physically and ideologically.
So instead of pretending to be an enemy's best friend while secretly plotting against them, which creates that toxic internal rust of the dual personality we talked about, you are instructed to be completely transparent.
You just tell them where you stand.
The stance is literally, we are not aligned. We operate on fundamentally different principles, and we are keeping our distance. You don't necessarily have to launch a preemptive attack on them, but you absolutely do not fake an alliance.
You don't compromise your psychological integrity out of fear, because to do so, according to Parwez, destroys the human self.
The psychological damage is the real threat.
Right. And the text uses a powerful historical example to set the standard of courage required for this system to work. It points to Pharaoh's sorcerers.
Oh man, this is one of the most vivid case studies in the notes. Let's paint the geopolitical picture of this moment for you listening, because it's not just a magic show. It's a clash of state systems.
It really is.
You have Pharaoh, who represents the ultimate exploitative tyrannical empire. He relies on a rigid class structure and state propaganda to maintain control over a massive labor force. And the sorcerers, well, they are the elites of that propaganda wing.
They are the state intellectuals. They're the illusionists who keep the populace in awe of Pharaoh's power. And they are summoned to publicly defeat Moses, who is challenging the very foundation of Pharaoh's exploitative economy.
Right.
Pharaoh promises these sorcerers immense wealth, closer proximity to the throne, basically the ultimate worldly rewards if they win this ideological battle.
But the narrative shifts so dramatically. When the sorcerers see the truth of Moses' message, when they realize that this isn't just a trick, but a fundamental truth about human dignity and divine law, they experience an immediate internal synchronization.
Their hearts align.
Yes. And here is the crucial part regarding Tekoya. They don't hide their realization. They don't think, okay, we believe Moses, but Pharaoh is a ruthless dictator, so let's just pretend we still support the empire, take the money, and secretly support Moses behind closed doors.
No, they reject the dual personality completely. I mean, in the middle of the royal court, surrounded by the military might of the empire, facing the absolute power of Pharaoh, they openly align their speech with their internal truth.
Just a massive act of defiance.
They declare their alignment with the system Moses is presenting.
And Pharaoh's reaction is swift and brutal state violence. He doesn't just threaten to fire them or imprison them. He threatens to cut off their hands and feet on opposite sides and crucify them on the trunks of palm trees.
It's pure terror.
He is threatening to make a terrifying public example of them to maintain the state's illusion of absolute control.
And the response to that threat is presented in the text as the absolute pinnacle of psychological synchronization. They essentially tell Pharaoh, do whatever you are going to do. Your jurisdiction, your power, only extends to this physical, biological life. We are not hiding our truth.
They don't even blink.
They openly declare their conviction without a shred of expediency or maslahat. And because of this absolute integrity, Parwez notes that the text says they earned Ayat Ejavidi.
Ayat Ejavidi.
Which means?
Eternal life. They demonstrated that they did not fear human adversaries or physical death. They only feared violating objective truth and compromising their own human self. Wow. Let's synthesize what this means for you, the listener, trying to decode this blueprint. It means the baseline requirement for this proposed societal architecture is a citizenry that categorically refuses to fracture their own psychology.
Exactly.
Truth is not treated as a variable that can be negotiated based on fear, political convenience, or economic pressure. A society built on citizens who say one thing in public and believe another in private, even for supposed survival, is viewed as already dead.
Under Parwez's framework, that society is structurally compromised from day one.
Yeah.
You simply cannot build a unified, resilient collective on a foundation of individual deceit. The math of the social physics just doesn't work.
Right. I see the systemic logic. We have established the required building blocks. We have a citizenry that is psychologically unified, possessing absolute integrity, rejecting fake alliances and expediency.
Right, the foundation is solid.
But this raises a really practical, operational question. How do individuals actually connect with the divine and, by extension, the state in the system?
That's the logical next step.
Because if we look at traditional religion, what Parwez calls mazhab, the instruction is usually to, love God and pray. You sit in your room or your designated house of worship. You cultivate a deep emotional warmth in your heart. You whisper your intercessory prayers, and you're considered a good practitioner.
That's the standard model, yeah.
But if this text is actually a constitutional blueprint for statecraft, how do love and prayer factor into running an economy or maintaining geopolitical borders? That feels like a massive leap.
Well, this is where Parwez's linguistic analysis really attempts to bridge the gap between theology and sociology. Let's look at the Arabic word hub, which appears prominently in verse 3.31.
Hub.
Yes. Traditionally, hub is translated universally as love. It's often framed as a sentimental, mystical, or romanticized affection for God.
Right.
It's the kind of love pursued through monasticism or sitting isolated in a cave, trying to induce a feeling of mystical union with the Creator.
And I've always found that concept confusing on a purely psychological level. Well, how do you systematically, emotionally love an unseen, abstract, infinite entity? It feels psychologically impossible to mandate an emotion. Like, I can love my family, I can love my dog, because they are tangible, biological realities I interact with.
You can feel affection for them.
Exactly. But an abstract, infinite concept, how do you legislate that feeling across a population of millions?
Parwez argues that you can't. And that's precisely the point. He posits that it is a psychological impossibility for a human being to feel sentimental, romantic love for a formless, unseen God in the same way they love a child or a spouse.
So the translation is the problem.
Yes. Therefore, translating hub merely as sentimental love fundamentally misguides the reader and pushes the text into the realm of mysticism rather than practical governance. If we look at the lexicographical root of hub, the letters hababa, Parwez notes that it functionally means to hold firmly.
To hold firmly.
It means to remain steadfast and to strictly adhere to something. The specific Arabic terms he connects it to are tamasuk or itisam, the act of holding fast.
Man, that reframes the entire concept of devotion. So loving God in this blueprint has absolutely nothing to do with an invisible emotional state.
Nothing at all.
It's not about closing your eyes, listening to serene music, and feeling a warm glow in your chest.
Not within this systemic framework. Here, loving God translates to strict, practical, unwavering adherence to divine laws. It is the civic duty of obedience to the Constitution.
Civic duty.
Right. Devotion to the divine is proven empirically through action, by holding fast to the legal and ethical framework provided, not through isolated chanting. You cannot love a constitution emotionally. You love the law by obeying it, defending it, and ensuring it is equitably upheld in your society.
That shifts the entire paradigm. It takes religion completely out of the private emotional sphere and drops it squarely into the public civic sphere.
It makes it observable.
Right. It makes faith measurable by your actions in the marketplace or the courthouse. But that brings up an even bigger question about practice. What about prayer? What about salat?
So
Because if hub isn't an emotion but an adherence to law, then salat can't just be a private ritual of whispering wishes to the sky or asking for personal favors. How does a daily prayer ritual fit into a civilizational blueprint?
well, the lecture notes redefine salat completely, moving it far beyond mere ritualistic prayer. Parwez describes salat not as the end goal of faith, but as the miniature form of the Quranic societal structure.
The miniature form.
Yes, it is meant to be a physical, daily manifestation of the collective discipline required to run the state.
Let's build a detailed visual analogy of this for the listener because the mechanics of it are brilliant when viewed through this lens.
Sure.
Imagine you are standing in a large congregation for Salat. You are not alone in your bedroom. You are standing in a massive hall, shoulder to shoulder with your fellow citizens.
Right.
And the physical requirement is to form perfectly straight, disciplined lines. There is no hierarchy in the rows. The wealthy merchant stands foot to foot with the laborer.
Everyone is equal in the line.
Exactly. And at the front of this synchronized collective is a central leader, the imam.
And consider the mechanics of what happens in that formation. What would occur if the individuals in those meticulously straight rows decided to operate based on their own individual preferences?
Oh, it would be a disaster.
Right. If one person decides they feel like bowing right now, while another prefers to remain standing. If someone decides to recite the text loudly because they feel particularly emotional, while others are trying to remain silent.
You would have total operational chaos. You'd have an uncoordinated mess of individuals rather than a unified body.
Precisely. Salat requires that all operational actions are strictly coordinated behind the central leadership. When the imam bows, the collective bows in unison. When the imam stands, the collective stands.
It's all synchronized.
It is a physical embodiment of surrendering the individual ego for the sake of the collective movement. But here is a crucial mechanical detail Parwez highlights. What happens if the imam, the leadership, makes an error?
Right, what if they mess up?
If the imam forgets a verse or makes an incorrect physical movement, the congregation does not blindly follow the error, nor do they break rank and start a riot. The collective is responsible for gently, verbally correcting the leader, ensuring the entire system returns to alignment with the foundational text.
It's a daily operational drill.
That's exactly what it is.
It's a psychological and physical training ground for citizenship. It's teaching the populace. This is exactly how we must operate when we walk outside the doors of this mosque. We move together, we follow the central authority to maintain order, we maintain discipline, and if leadership deviates from the Constitution, we have a mechanism to correct it collectively to prevent systemic collapse.
It is the ultimate demonstration of Dinah's system of life in practice. Parwez argues that if you just perform the physical motions of salat inside a building, but then walk out into the market and engage in corrupt business practices, exploit your workers, or harbor that toxic dual personality,
You've completely missed the point of the exercise.
you have entirely missed the point of the drill. You have successfully performed a ritual, but you have failed the system it was meant to train you for.
This completely changes the scale of what we are looking at. We now have a theoretical citizenry that is psychologically unified, no hypocrites, no dual personalities. They are highly disciplined, they understand that their love for the system is proven through measurable adherence to the law, and they practice this unity and error correction daily.
It's a powerful framework.
It is. So if we have perfectly synchronized individuals practicing this daily drill of unity, what are they actually powering? A drill implies a larger machine. What is the macro structure they are building? Now we have to move from the individual building blocks to the central authority itself.
This brings us to a fundamental distinction Parwez draws in his notes between the concepts of din and mazhab. We've used these terms a bit, but we need to define them analytically to understand the macro structure.
Right, let's break them down.
Mazhab, which is generally translated as religion, is described in this framework as inherently fragmenting. It divides humanity into isolated sects and denominations, where every group creates its own individualized version of obedience based on specific rituals or dogmas.
Everyone in their own little bubble.
Exactly. People retreat into their own private theological spaces, seeking personal individual salvation in an afterlife, largely disconnected from the socio-economic realities of their neighbors.
In that view, religion is a private, intercessory transaction between you and the cosmos. Your neighbor's poverty doesn't necessarily invalidate your personal salvation as long as you perform your rituals correctly.
Exactly. But din is presented as entirely different. Din is defined as a unified system of life.
Okay.
It requires collective adherence to a central authority, which Parwez refers to as the Markazi Malat.
So it's inherently collective.
You cannot have din in isolation. You cannot be a nation of one. It demands a societal structure.
And this leads directly into the analysis of verse 3.32, which states, "Obey Allah and the Messenger." Now, I want to unpack the grammatical analysis provided in the notes here because it addresses a massive point of contention in traditional theology.
Yes, this is a major divergence.
Historically, people read, "Obey Allah and the Messenger," and they interpret it as splitting their loyalty into two separate parallel buckets of law.
Right.
Bucket 1, obey God, which means reading the primary text, the Quran. Bucket 2, obey the messenger, which traditionally means following secondary historical traditions, reports, or sayings attributed to the prophet regarding his daily life and rulings outside the Quran.
That is the standard theological reading across many sects, yes.
Yeah.
It creates two distinct sources of jurisprudence. But Parwez applies a rigorous grammatical and systemic lens to this exact phrase.
What does he find?
He points out that in the original Arabic of the Quran, when referring to Allah and the Messenger in this specific context of obedience, the text uses a singular pronoun to refer to them.
Wait, a singular pronoun?
Yes. It does not treat them as two separate entities demanding separate allegiances.
A singular pronoun. That's a massive grammatical clue. It means the text is not asking for divided loyalties to two separate sources of authority.
According to this reading, Allah and the Messenger represents one unified constitutional authority. The divine law, Allah, serves as the constitution, the immutable foundational principles.
But a constitution cannot enforce itself.
Precisely. A book sitting on a desk cannot build roads, distribute wealth, negotiate treaties, or defend borders. The divine law must be enacted, interpreted for the era, and enforced through a central state authority.
Oh, okay.
That executive branch was historically embodied by the messenger, and subsequently it is meant to be carried on by the Khilafat ala Minhaju Nubuwah, which translates to a system of collective governance operating on the methodology of prophethood.
So when the text says, obey Allah and the messenger, Parwez is arguing it essentially means obey the Constitution as it is implemented and enforced by the legitimate state authority.
That is the systemic translation, yes.
It is a demand for civic obedience to a just system. And if you fragment this system, if you say, I'm going to follow God my own way, in my own isolated sect, ignoring the central authority, the lecture notes suggest you are committing kufr, which is rejection, and shirk, which is polytheism.
But not polytheism in the way we usually think about it.
Right. Not in a mystical sense of bowing to stone idols, but in the systemic sense of dividing and diluting the unified authority of the state.
That's the systemic definition of shirk right there, creating parallel centers of power that rival the constitutional center.
Wow.
But we have to ask, why is this unified authority so critical? What is its actual tangible purpose? An authority that just demands obedience for the sake of power is tyranny.
Right. That's just a dictatorship.
Exactly. This leads us to the very heart of the blueprint. The economic engine of the society, which Parwez calls the Nizam-e-Rububiyat, or the system of providence.
The system of providence. Let's dig into that.
Let's trace this back to the word hub, which we earlier redefined as adherence or holding fast. Parwez notes a fascinating linguistic etymology here. The root of hub adherence is deeply related to the Arabic word hab, which translates to a seed or a grain of crop.
I love the mechanics of this metaphor. Let's unpack the relationship between the citizen, the state, and the seed.
Okay, so when a society collectively adheres to the divine law, when they exhibit hub, the divine system is designed to reciprocate. Verse 3.31 states, if you adhere to the law, Allah will love you.
But again, we've established God's love isn't a warm, emotional feeling.
Right. The text says God acts as a wali. Now, wali is often weakly translated in religious texts as a friend or a saint. But in the Quranic systemic lexicon that Parwez is using, a wali is an active guardian, a protector, a hands-on overseer of development.
So when the system is functioning correctly, the divine law acts as the guardian of the society. But how does that manifest practically in the economy? Because, invisible guardianship doesn't put food on the table.
It manifests entirely through the central authority, the markaz. The state acts as the physical agency of this divine guardianship, and its primary constitutional job is to nurture human potential.
Nurturing the seed.
Yes, think of a human being like a hab, a seed. A seed contains immense latent potential. It has the genetic blueprint to become a towering tree or a stalk of wheat. But if you take that seed and leave it on a sterile concrete floor or lock it in a dark drawer, it will never grow.
It possesses the potential, but it is denied the environment.
The role of the state, under the system of providence, is to provide the fertile soil, the equitable distribution of water, and the access to sunlight so that every single seed, every single citizen, can develop their latent potentials and reach full maturity.
That is profound, but I want to get down to the actual mechanisms of this Nizam-e-Rububiyat, because providing soil and water sounds great conceptually, but in economic terms, how does this central authority acquire and distribute these resources?
That is the big question.
Is this blueprint just advocating for a tyrannical communist state where the government seizes all property and enforces identical outcomes for everyone?
That's a vital distinction to make. The lecture notes indicate that it is not about forced equal outcomes, which, as you noted, often requires tyranny to maintain. It is about equitable access to the means of development.
Okay, so how does it work without tyranny?
The mechanism relies on a concept the Quran calls afazio, which translates to the surplus.
The surplus.
The system trains its citizens, through that psychological synchronization and daily discipline we discussed, to voluntarily return their surplus wealth, whatever is beyond their fundamental needs, back to the markas.
Oh, voluntarily.
Yes. The state then acts as the central distributive node. It takes this surplus and channels it toward those who are structurally disadvantaged or lack the capital to develop their own seed.
So it's an economic engine designed specifically to prevent the hoarding of wealth while still allowing for private enterprise and individual effort.
Exactly.
It ensures that the basic structural needs, access to education, to healthcare, to capital, to opportunity, are guaranteed by the state.
Exactly. If a citizen in this society is starving, if they are structurally oppressed, or if they are denied an education because of their birth circumstances, the seed is being actively denied water. In Parwez's view, a society that allows this to happen is structurally failing its primary constitutional duty of rububiyat, of providence.
This makes treating the Quran merely as a book of rituals seem not just misguided, but actively harmful.
It's a massive dereliction of duty.
By focusing on how to perfectly pronounce the Arabic syllables of these verses while ignoring the economic mandate, a society is ignoring the blueprint for a socio-economic engine designed to eradicate poverty.
Right.
The text is demanding that the wealth and resources of the earth are utilized to bring every human crop to a thriving, ripe harvest, and instead, people are just reciting the demand as a chant.
It is the ultimate tragedy of the ritual trap. The blueprint for limitless clean energy is sitting right there, but society is freezing in the dark because they think the blueprint itself is supposed to generate the heat.
This raises the stakes significantly. If this isn't just a moral guidebook, but a scientifically precise blueprint for a unified, equitable, functioning society, what happens if a society ignores it?
Well, there are consequences.
What happens if they hoard their surplus wealth, allow the dual personality to flourish in their politics, and fracture into 100 isolated religious sects? Traditional religion often relies on the threat of divine punishment, a bolt of lightning from an angry god, or fire and brimstone. How does this rationalist systemic text view the concept of divine punishment for failing the system?
This brings us to the final major concept in today's exegesis, the social physics, and specifically the law of mukafat iyamal, which translates to the law of the consequence of actions. In verse 3.3, the text delivers what sounds like a chilling statement. It says that God warns you of himself.
I want to introduce a new analogy here to help us grasp this, because warns you of himself sounds intimidating.
It does sound ominous.
It sounds almost like an autocrat threatening his subjects with arbitrary violence if they disobey him. But based on what we've discussed, I like to think of this warning more like the design limitations of a deep-sea submarine.
A submarine. I like where this is going.
If engineers build a submarine to withstand the crushing pressure of the ocean at 10,000 feet, they provide strict schematics. If the builders decide to cut corners, if they use cheap, deceitful materials, or if the welders harbor a dual personality and lie about the integrity of the hull, the submarine will inevitably implode when it reaches depth.
It has to. It's physics.
Right. The ocean isn't angry at the submarine. The ocean doesn't have an ego, and it isn't seeking vengeance because the builders disrespected it. The implosion is just the immutable law of physics asserting itself against a compromised structure.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize social physics. And Parwez's analysis aligns perfectly with that. He explains that this ominous-sounding warning, warns you of himself, is explicitly paired in the very same verse with the divine attribute of Ra'uf.
Ra'uf.
Ro translates to deep paternal affection or profound compassion.
That seems like a paradox. I am warning you of my wrath, but I am deeply compassionate. How do those two fit together in the submarine analogy?
Because it isn't wrath. It's a statement of reality. God is not presented as a tyrant threatening humanity with arbitrary torture. The divine is acting out of compassion, warning humanity of the immutable, unforgiving laws of cause and effect.
Oh, wow.
It is the architect pleading with the builders. Do not use cheap steel because the pressure of the ocean will crush you.
That is incredible.
The law of mukafat i'amal is the law of cause and effect applied strictly to human action and societal conduct. The universe is governed by precise, immutable measurements. Every hidden intent, every systemic implementation of the dual personality, every act of economic injustice where the seed is denied water, every lie told for political expediency, it is all recorded by the natural laws of the universe.
Nothing escapes the physics.
Right. And it will inevitably, unavoidably, bring about destructive consequences for that society.
So we aren't talking about some mystical concept of karma where the universe magically balances a ledger. We're talking about observable, mechanical, social physics.
Exactly.
Let's trace the collapse. If you build a society on the foundation of kiz, where people's hearts and tongues are disconnected, where expediency is the rule, what happens? Trust evaporates.
You can't trust anyone.
Right. Without trust, economic transactions become incredibly friction-heavy or fail entirely. Paranoia sets in at the state level. The government has to spend vast resources monitoring its own citizens. The central authority fractures into competing factions.
It all unravels.
The economic engine stalls because people begin hoarding resources out of fear rather than distributing them. The structure simply implodes from the inside under the pressure of reality.
Precisely. A society's survival is scientifically, inextricably tied to its ethical and economic justice. You cannot build a lasting civilization on a foundation of falsehood, exploitation, and inequality. It violates the structural load limits of the blueprint.
It's just bad engineering.
Right. To turn away from this structured, equitable system is the very definition of kufri in this context. It is the rejection of the life-sustaining machinery. And if a society commits kufr by ignoring the blueprint, the text suggests that the natural laws of the universe will simply refuse to protect or nurture that society.
It just lets it fail.
The civilization will collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions and rot, just as surely as that submarine implodes if you ignore the laws of physics.
And when verse 3.30 states that on the day of judgment, every soul will confront what it has done, and those who lived hypocritically will wish for a vast, insurmountable distance between themselves and their actions. It takes on a much more terrifying mechanical reality.
It really does.
It means there is no escape from the physics of your actions.
There is no theological loophole. You cannot perform a specific chant or a private ritual or offer an intercessory prayer to magically erase the systemic damage of an unjust economy or a deceitful political career.
You can't pray away a cracked hull.
Exactly. The structural consequences must be faced. The submarine is already underwater, the pressure is already applying. This is the stark, rational, and unyielding reality of the Quranic system, as Parwez outlines it.
Wow. We have covered an immense, challenging amount of ground today, and honestly, the paradigm shift is staggering. For you listening, I want you to take a moment and think about the journey we've just taken through these notes.
It's a lot to process.
It is. We started by looking at a text that is almost universally treated across the globe as a religious placeholder, verses recited for invisible blessings used to inaugurate a new building, or whispered for good luck in personal endeavors.
Just treated as a charm.
Right. And we've seen how, through this rationalist, systemic lens, it transforms into a highly technical civilizational blueprint. It demands absolute psychological synchronization, the total eradication of the dual personality, even in the face of death, like pharaoh sorcerers.
Which requires immense courage.
It does. It redefines devotion to the divine not as a mystical, emotional high, but as disciplined, observable, collective adherence to a constitutional authority.
A complete shift in what faith looks like.
And crucially, it outlines a state designed to act as an active guardian, utilizing surplus wealth to nurture human potential like a seed into a thriving crop, all bound by the immutable physical laws of cause and effect.
It is a total reconstruction of how a reader is meant to engage with the text. But, as we synthesize the permanent value of what Parwez has outlined here, we have to acknowledge a looming reality.
Oh, what's that?
What we've established so far, moving through verse 28 to 32, is the perfect internal architecture of this society. We've described a theoretical citizenry that always tells the truth, a central authority that distributes resources perfectly and equitably, and a societal machine perfectly aligned with natural law.
Right. It's a beautifully functioning submarine in a perfectly calm testing pool. But out in the open ocean, the real world is vicious.
Exactly. And this brings us to the inevitable next step in the text progression. What happens when this perfectly synchronized, truth-telling, economically just society is confronted by an external power?
Because there's always an external power.
Always. What happens when this Markaz faces a neighboring civilization that operates on the complete opposite principles? An empire that relies entirely on deceit, exploitative capitalism, imperialism, and brute military force.
Because you can't just ignore a hostile army at your borders by being really honest and equitable internally. Your perfect economic engine will just be plundered.
Precisely. How does the Markaz, this central authority, pivot from internal nurturing and resource distribution to external survival and geopolitical strategy? How do you maintain psychological integrity and transparent truthfulness when fighting a war against an enemy that uses deception and propaganda as their primary weapons?
That is the ultimate geopolitical cliffhanger. How does the law of requital, this social physics we discussed, apply on a brutal global battlefield? That is the question we will explore as we move into the next logical progression of this text.
It's going to be an intense discussion.
I can't wait. But for now, I invite you to take everything we've discussed today, the absolute rejection of the dual personality, the true operational meaning of collective discipline, the state as a cultivator of human seeds, and apply the systemic lens to the world around you.
Look at the structures we rely on today.
Exactly. Look at the institutions, the political rhetoric, and the economic systems of our modern age. Where do you see the rust hollowing out the load-bearing walls of our societies? Where are we trying to build on a foundation of kiz?
It's a sobering question to ask.
It is, because remember our blueprint for the nuclear reactor. We can't afford to leave it framed on the wall as a mere decoration anymore, hoping it will magically save us. The schematics are clear, the social physics are real. The only question left is, are we brave enough to take it down and actually build the machine? Keep questioning, keep analyzing the structures around you, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.